All right, so today we're kicking off a new series. And it's kind of interesting for me whenever we get to a new series, because I have a kind of a process that I go through. Now, of course, it's anchored in prayer, right? So when I'm doing something new, I'm kind of like, God, what do you want me to talk about? And it comes kind of one of two ways. Sometimes he'll give me a list of kind of individual things I should talk about, so I kind of get the weekly messages first, and I tie that together with a common theme. Other times, I feel like I get the theme first, and I build the messages kind of in between that. And this series is kind of interesting, that I had the individual messages, but pulling the theme together, I was kind of looking for some leading from God on that, and I wasn't quite sure where to go. And sometimes inspiration comes from really unexpected places. In my case, it came from a 1980s movie, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Now, if you don't know that movie, it was actually a pretty successful movie in the late 80s. It's Keanu Reeves before he was really famous. And the movie's premise is kind of strange. It's a comedy, so it's kind of silly. But what you do is you have these two high school kids who have this really important history exam. And they're not as prepared as they'd like to be. And it's the day before the exam. And studying's not getting it done for them. So through a series of very unusual events, they arrive at a time machine. And so now what they're able to do is they're actually able to go back in time and visit the individual historical characters and actually talk to them. And so what they find when they make this trip is that the historical characters, and again, keep in mind, it's a really silly movie. It's family friendly, but it's really silly. And as they meet the characters, they realize that the real people are much more interesting than they first looked like on the page. That there's actually more going on, that they're real people with real lives and real personalities. And in some cases, they're more complex people than they would have expected. But in other ways, they're kind of more simple in the sense that they have more in common with even some of the most ancient historical characters than they ever would have expected. And so that made me think that if we could go back in time and we could talk to those first century Jesus followers, what would we find, right? And what would they want us to understand? And what would they want us to focus on? Because I think that if we could go back and talk to those first Jesus followers, we'd want to know, what happened in your lives? You got to walk with Jesus, or you got to know people who walked with Jesus. And what did you learn from that experience? And what did you believe about Jesus? What made you believe in Jesus? And then if we think about it, as we go back there, their experiences cover a lot of stuff, right? They start out just meeting Jesus, thinking he's just a rabbi, right? Just a teacher. But as they walk with him, they start to see things. And then over time, at the end of the ministry, of Jesus' earthly ministry, they see him predict that he will die and come back from the dead. Now, lots of people predict that, but when someone actually pulls it off, right, that's kind of unique. And so they saw that and they experienced that. So once you understood those things, as you reflected back on your earlier experiences, how did you see things as you thought about all that? Now, in our case, we can't go back and talk to them, but we do have the information, right? We have that in what we call the New Testament. And the thing that's so important to remember about the entire Bible, but particularly the New Testament, is that this was never originally intended as a single compiled document. Right? These are a series of documents written by people based on experiences. Right? The first four are about the life of Jesus. 3 of those are actually written by people who were actually with Jesus, or at least were dictated by people who were with Jesus. Then we have what we call the Acts of the Apostles, which is what life was like for those very first Jesus followers as they went out and started to share what they experienced. And then the rest of it is basically a series of letters addressing the first century church. So there's a lot about what goes on there. But what we want to do is make sure that we don't make the mistake of just looking at this as flat information on a page. We want to remember that these, again, were real people. And real people living in a certain context in a certain time. And so as we look at the information that's there, we want to make sure we're looking at it in the context where they heard it. Because our temptation is going to be to try to look at it from a 21st century context. And a lot has gone on in 2,000 years, as you might expect. A lot of stuff's going to happen in 2,000 years. And a lot of things have been layered on top of that they didn't actually have at that time, things that they didn't have to think about, things that they didn't think about. And so I think that if we went back and we told them kind of all the different things that Christians fight about today, that disagree on today, that disagree with one another about today, I think what they would tell us is they focused on a really simple message. A really simple message, which is what they saw and what they learned by following Jesus changed their lives. It created life transformation. And then as they went forward, they took that really simple message of the life transformation offered by Jesus. And then Christianity began to flourish. And we have to remember that in the first century, the opposition to Christianity was tremendous, tremendous. Yet in spite of all that opposition, it grew rapidly and it spread rapidly. All because of a simple message that they focused on. So with all that in mind, today we're going to kick off our own series here, A Most Excellent Adventure. If you've seen the movie, that's actually funny, just so you know. A Most Excellent Adventure. And today in part one, I want to talk about expecting the unexpected. And I'm going to kind of repeatedly remind us as we go through this series that we want to look at these individuals in the accounts from the New Testament as real life people. And we want to understand the context that they lived in. And today what I'd like us to focus on is that what was it that caused some of those first followers to become followers? What is it that got their attention? And when did they first get a sense of who Jesus is? And how did it move them? And if we could go back and say, tell us what's important. What should we hold on to? They would then come back to us and say that, well, you know, there's a lot of things going on, but you want to just be careful about how much you expect, what you expect. Don't get caught up in preconceived expectations. Be open-minded. Because if we ran back to those first Jesus followers, and we ran up to them, and I know me, you guys know that not talking fast is a constant struggle for me. That I always want to say about 5 times more than anybody wants to hear. Not just in terms of volume, but also in terms of time, right? And so if I was to go back there, what would I do? I'd run up and like, you know, when did you believe? You know, when did you know? And what would be the first thing they would tell me? Slow down, right? Slow down. And they would want us to understand that although we look back on their lives as these kind of the great soldiers of faith, for lack of a better term, they would want us to understand that it didn't all happen at once. That they went through a process that started out with some interest, and then the more they saw, the more they understood. The more they understood, the more they believed. So they would tell us to keep an open mind. And don't be overly focused on what you expect God to do next. And don't get tied up in preconceived ideas that you always know exactly how God works. Because if we do that, if we get caught up in our own expectations of what God is doing, we might miss what he's actually doing. And I think they would tell us that that's what's most important. To not miss what he's actually doing by deciding in advance what you think he's doing. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that the path for those apostles becoming what we now know as apostles, I mean, at first they were just people, right? People. Some of them were fishermen, other ones had other jobs. But the path of them becoming what we know as apostles was different for each one of them. I mean, we do know that some of them followed Jesus directly, that they saw Jesus go by, or they had actually had experiences directly with him, and that caused them to follow him. We know that that was the case with Andrew. We know that that was the case with Philip. We believe that was likely the case with John. But other people who became apostles had to be invited by family and friends. We know that Peter was actually invited to meet Jesus by his brother Andrew. And we know that Nathanael was invited by Philip. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is that if we could be there and we could watch Nathanael's first experiences, our expectation would be that he would never believe in Jesus. Because Nathanael starts out incredibly cynical about Jesus. But then he has a personal experience that causes him to move very quickly towards a deep belief. Because we know that when Philip has already started following Jesus, and he comes back to Nathanael, and he goes to Nathanael, there's this guy, Jesus from Nazareth. You've got to meet him. We think he might be the one. Nathanael says, Nazareth? There's no way any great man of anything is coming from a city like Nazareth. That nothing good can come from Nazareth. His actual words in English are, can anything good come from Nazareth? Because he had an expectation of what this great leader was going to be like and where he was going to come from. So now Philip has a choice, right? Philip can either try to force the issue. So you say, no, you have to come, which probably wouldn't work. Philip could have walked away. Or Philip could basically say, you know what? Just come see for yourself. You just check it out. See what you think. And that's what Philip did. And because of that, Nathanael was willing to just go hear what Jesus had to say. And although Nathanael had specific expectations, when he got there, what he experienced was not what he expected. As he walks up, he hasn't even said hello to Jesus yet. As he walks up, as Jesus catches sight of Nathanael, Jesus greets him like he actually knows him. And Jesus greets him as Nathanael. Hey, here's Nathanael. Man, he's a good and honest man. Now, of course, that catches Nathanael off guard because they don't know each other. So if we look, when that happens, Nathanael says, how do you know about me? And Jesus replied, I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you. Now, if you read that, that looks like one of the great statements of faith right there. I could see you under a tree. But that statement transformed Nathanael. Now, the thing here is that we don't know what was happening under that tree when Philip goes out to meet Nathanael. We don't know if Nathanael was praying. We don't know if he was dealing with some kind of personal crisis. Maybe he was struggling with his faith. Just possibly. He may have been asking God, give me a sign of what you want me to do next. We don't know what was going on with Nathanael, but Jesus knew. And when that happens, Jesus' comment has this huge impact on Nathanael. Basically, we're told that then Nathanael exclaimed, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, the King of Israel. Now, we would never expect that statement to have that kind of transformation, but there was this personal connection, personal relationship that Jesus was able to tap into. And because of that, it clearly touched Nathanael in a deep and personal way. And in that, at that time, it appears that Nathanael now instantly is convinced that Jesus is the Son of God, that he's what we call the Messiah. Now, as we see that, I think that it's very common to believe that that's what it's like for all the apostles. That all the apostles just came along and they just believed. But that's not how it worked. It didn't work that way for them. And honestly, it doesn't work that way for most of us. That most of us need time to develop a deeper faith, to start to believe. And we're actually told that that was the case with most of the apostles. That the Apostle John goes on to tell us that there was actually a particular event that occurred that caused the apostles to start believing, caused most of them to start believing. Up until then, they largely just thought that Jesus was this great rabbi, this great teacher. But there was something that happened that changed that perspective, that said he must be something more. And that event was what's often known as the wedding at Cana. If you've been around church a long time, you know the wedding at Cana. If you don't know that name, you probably know what happened there. There's a day where Jesus turns water into wine. And John tells us that it was that event that caused them to see Jesus differently. What John tells us is this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. So what John is telling us is that that's when they knew, when they saw that happen. That's when they realized that he wasn't just a special rabbi. He wasn't just this great teacher. I mean, he was those things, but he was something much more. And what's interesting is that these disciples had already been listening to Jesus for a bit before this happened. But they couldn't see who he was yet until this thing happened. You know, and I think that if we could actually sit down and we could actually talk to John, I think that's what he would point out. That they needed time for their faith to grow and develop so they could understand who Jesus is. Just like we need to take time, right? That they would tell us that, you know, as apostles, they had a lot of growing to do. You know, they didn't start out the way they ended up. So for each of us, we want to give ourselves the time that we need to grow and to understand. And I think that we all want to remember a few things as we kind of look at these gospel accounts. It's so important to understand that the gospel accounts, right, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we have to understand that those books were not written while stuff was happening, right? It wasn't like John was sitting there with a notebook in his back pocket, kind of taking notes as everything happened. That's not when these books were written. These books were written, or technically these books were recorded later, after the apostles had already spent years with Jesus watching his life. And they had experienced the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so after all that, then they sat down and they reflected on not just what they knew at the time, but what they would see later, and could go back and reframe those events and start to understand them more deeply. And so these gospel accounts are written from the context of all the things they already know now as they look back in time on what was going on. So if we were to sit down with John, he would say that, you know, when that water in the wine thing happened, I mean, that blew our minds, right? That was this amazing event. But at that time, we thought it was just a miracle. Now, that sounds kind of crazy, but, you know, we knew it had to be from God. But we thought it was just this miraculous thing that he was doing. And it was a miracle, but it wasn't just a miracle. John would tell us that later, as he thought back about what was going on, they later realized that it was actually a miraculous sign. In other words, it was actually pointing to something. This wasn't just an action on behalf of God. It was pointing to something about who Jesus is. And what Jesus was doing there that they couldn't understand at the time is he was pointing to the fact that he was doing something completely unexpected. And I can imagine that if we're sitting down with John, and as he starts to tell us that there was so much more going on than we realized, he would say, let me just tell you about all the details. Let me tell you what it all meant, what we later realized it all meant. He says, we're at this wedding, and it's a big wedding, and weddings back then went on for days. And so there's this big wedding, and there are lots of people. And with this big wedding, with this obviously wealthy family, the wine starts to run out. Now, we don't know that they didn't buy enough wine. People were drinking more wine than they thought. All we know is the wine starts to run out, and that's going to be a huge embarrassment to this family. And John would tell us that, we're there, we see this about to happen, and Jesus' mom walks up to him. And Jesus' mom says to Jesus, you have to help these people. And we're kind of like, yeah, he's a great teacher and all, but I don't know how teaching them anything is going to fix this problem. But then John would say, but what he did next, it blew our minds. We couldn't never seen this coming. He says, and honestly, what he was doing, we didn't get at the time. He would go on to tell us that standing nearby were 6 stone water jars used for Jewish ceremonial washing. Each could hold 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. Now, what John would tell us, since he knows we're not from the first century, John would tell us is that they just look like jars to you. But there's so much more than that. That these jars that are off in the corner, they're actually ceremonial jars, meaning that they are part of our religious practice at that time. And what's so important to understand is that these jars and the water and the washing that occurred, it was part of the ceremonial process. That as part of their traditions in the first century, as a first century Jew, they had to become what's called ceremonially clean. So what that means is they had to wash in a certain way, and these jars were a key part of that. So what they had to do in order to be seen as clean before God, they had to go through and wash up using these jars. And without doing that, there were things they were not allowed to do. And I will tell you that what many 21st century theologians tell us is that those jars were the very symbol of what we call the Old Covenant, or what's sometimes called the sacrificial system. In other words, they are the very symbol of the way belief and relationship with God worked prior to Jesus. So with that in mind, as we're talking to John, John would say, you know what? We saw him have put water in those jars, but we couldn't imagine what he was going to do with them. But then he turned the water into wine. And he didn't make a big deal about it. He just did it. And then he told the servants at the wedding to go over to the master of ceremonies and let him test the wine. And then master of ceremonies tastes the wine. And you can just see the look on his face that this is better wine than he's ever tasted. So the master of ceremonies calls over the groom. And he says, a host always serves the best wine first. Then when everyone has had a lot to drink, he brings out the less expensive wine. But you have kept the best until now. And what John would then tell us is that, again, at that time, at first we thought it was a miracle. And in fact, throughout that time, we still thought it was just a miracle. And seeing that miracle did cause us to believe in Jesus, but it caused us to have just one level of belief in Jesus. But later, as we had a chance to think about what had just happened, we realized that it wasn't just a miracle, it was more than a miracle. And it would literally take us years to understand what Jesus had done, what it really meant. And in fact, John would tell us that it wouldn't be till after what we know as the Last Supper, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, and I would bet even years of thinking about it after that, before they would understand. Because John would tell us that, after all that time went by, and we remembered what happened to Cana, and then as we thought about that, we remembered that last meal we had with Jesus before he went to the cross. And we remembered about the water that was part of this old covenant becoming wine. And then we remembered that Last Supper with Jesus. Because we're told that after supper, Jesus took another cup of wine and said, "This cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you." And so it was only years later, as we looked at those two situations, that we realized that what happened at Cana was a sign. It was a sign of who Jesus is, that he is the Messiah. But it also was a sign of what he was doing. Because what we didn't understand was that Jesus was doing something brand new. Because we want to remember that those first century, not Jesus, but they were Jews back then, not Jesus followers yet. Those first century Jews, expected the Messiah to continue what was already there, just kind of keep building on what was already there. And then Jesus was doing something brand new. And what he was doing is he'd shown up and he had fulfilled that old covenant, and he's establishing this new covenant. But we want to remember what the Master of Ceremony says. You save the best for last. This new covenant under Jesus, having now fulfilled the old, is doing something new. He's providing a better way for God and people to be connected. And John would tell us that as big as it was, all of them needed time to understand because it was so far beyond what they had pictured. And I think that that's what John would tell us, that all the apostles would tell us, in fact, to keep an open mind, right? No matter what you're doing, no matter where you are in your faith journey, understand that spiritual growth takes time, right? If you're just kind of checking out faith for the first time and you want to understand more, understand that you're not going to understand it all at once. If you've just started to live a life of faith, understand it takes a while to understand. If you've been a person of faith your entire life, understand that growth takes time. And particularly living in the 21st century, we can be so tempted to try to accelerate things and move them faster. And I am as guilty of that as anyone. But we see more. We get to do more. We get to experience more if we will set aside our expectations. Because if we get overly focused on our expectations, that means we start taking actions based on what we expect to happen. And if we do that, we're likely to miss what God is actually doing in our lives. And as we try to hurry ourselves along, we can hurry right past what God is trying to show us in our lives. So what I want to encourage all of us to do as we look to the week ahead and the weeks ahead, to make a conscious effort to take time, to embrace faith, to seek out faith, but do it with an open mind. Bring those practices that make you feel connected to God into your life. But don't assume what God's going to do with those experiences. Let's open our minds and let's trust that if we do that, God will do bigger things than we could ever expect.